Alright, so the next part that I wanted to address for my reasons for leaving Christianity is a lack of zeal from just the typical Christian in everyday life. The lack of proselytizing in the Christian faith. And I mean like personal proselytizing and evangelizing. It's very much corporate proselytizing and evangelizing, but not personal. What I mean by this is you don't see the pastor of a church going door to door and sharing the gospel. You don't see most, if not all, members of a church sharing the gospel at their workplace. And I know you can say, well, that would be disruptive to the work environment, but from the Christian's perspective, my former perspective, you believe that these people are going to hell for eternity. And you're going to be alive for what? A maximum of 100 years, most likely 80 or less. And you think that the suffering you're going to encounter from a work environment that's subpar for maybe some of those 80 years, you think that that suffering you're going to encounter is worse than the eternity that the other person you might bother, that the eternity that they're going to spend in hell, you think that that suffering you're going to endure is not worth saving them from an eternity in hell? And what gets me is that other Christians never thought like this, like I did. Because if you're truly a Christian, it only makes sense to spend every waking minute of your life sharing the gospel. Because if you're a Christian, by the book, that means that you believe that everyone else that doesn't believe Christianity is true is going to hell for forever. So if you're truly a loving person, like Christ would be, then you have no other choice than to go and share the gospel, right? And I know you can say, oh, well, what if people don't listen or whatever? Isn't it worth trying? Don't you think it's worth trying if it means even a slight possibility that they might believe? Because otherwise they're going to go to hell for forever. And another argument I'll hear is people will say, well, people already know about Jesus. We're in the West, we're in the United States. It's not like that anymore. I mean, what, 20%, if not more, of the United States is immigrants? So there's so many people that are unfamiliar with it. And just because you've heard of it doesn't mean you actually know it. Someone could have heard your name, for example, but that doesn't mean they know you. They could have heard things about you, but that doesn't mean they actually understand you. It's the same thing with Christianity. And even if they had heard it theoretically and chosen not to believe it, don't you think it'd be worth it to implore them and beg them to change their mind if you believe they're going to be suffering and burning for eternity, and if you claim to be a selfless person? Because if you weren't a Christian, wouldn't you want someone to do the same thing for you? If it meant you got to live for eternity in heaven with Christ, wouldn't it be worth it, those few years of suffering, a maximum of 80 or 90 or 100 years? Don't you think that's really not that much in the grand scheme of things? 100 years divided by a trillion times a trillion times a trillion times a gazillion comes down to a number so small that it's basically zero. So in the grand scheme of eternity, your life right now is basically nothing. So it only makes sense to spend that proselytizing, evangelizing, trying to change people's minds so that we can have more people in heaven, right? And even though you might face some sort of suffering or hardships, don't you think it's worth it in the long run so that people can live forever in heaven? I mean, what does it matter if you have a bad life for 80 years? And you can say, oh, this is martyrdom or whatever. So, if you actually believe what you believe is true, then you would do this. And this is one of the things that gets me. And I would talk to my parents about this, like, why don't you do this? They're like, well, you're right, I guess we should do this. And I'm trying to do this more. But it's always in very vague ways, like I'm leading by example, or I'm being kind to them. But anybody can do that. You're acting like being a good person is unique to Christians. Anyone can do that. There's plenty of good people that aren't Christians and that are atheists, matter of fact. So you can't just go around being a good person and think that that's going to lead people to Christ. Because according to Christianity, you can be a good person in view of the world and still go to hell for forever. So when I would say that to my parents, they'd be like, oh, well, you're right. But I guess you just got to have faith. It's like, what do you mean have faith? Aren't you here on earth to share the gospel with others? Isn't God supposed to use you as a vessel until he comes back one day to bring his followers with him? Who else is going to share the gospel if not you? You know, you can say, oh, well, missionaries. It's like, okay. How many people are we going to reach with just a couple missionaries for every church? And what makes them more obligated to share the gospel than you? And then they would say, oh, well, we're using our money to fund them sharing the gospel. And it's like, oh, so they're the only ones that have to share the gospel? And they'd be like, oh, well, it's a calling thing. Bro, what? No. So you're basically saying you're okay with people going to hell for forever. That it's not your job. But somehow it's the missionary's job? You don't feel called to it. It means you just don't believe Christianity. You don't believe that the Bible is true. Or you're just an asshole. You're just an asshole that doesn't care about other people. So you're not really a Christian, because being a Christian means being like Christ. So you can't call yourself a Christian anymore. You can call yourself a book club member of First Baptist Church of somewhere, but you're not a Christian. And you can't act like the two are mutually exclusive. You can fund missionaries and still be a missionary. You know, I don't understand why you think you have to be a missionary and that's all you do. You can be rich and also be a missionary. Share the gospel with people at work. Aren't they going to go to hell if you don't? Who's going to share the gospel with them if not you? The missionaries that are going to Morocco are in Morocco. You're the missionary for your workplace. Why don't you go and share the gospel with them? Who's going to be the missionary in your life? You know, and there's no answer for that. And they'll say faith. Well, maybe God will use someone. God is using you. So why don't you do it? And the answer is they don't actually believe what they say they believe. They are a member of the Baptist Book Club, but they're not actually Christians. Because if they really believed what they were saying, they would go knock down the doors of people to share the word of God with them. And of course, that wouldn't be a good thing for the rest of us. But I'm just saying, if they actually believed it, that's what we're talking about. Just if they believed it, that's what they would do. That's my only point I'm trying to make, is they don't actually believe it. Because they believe somehow magically God will change their minds. Ultimately, that's not how it works, though. Someone has to tell them. If they don't already know, someone has to tell them. And you're assuming everyone already knows. And you're assuming that they're listening to the voice of God, too. So wouldn't it make sense to implore them to share the gospel? So that was another thing that moved me away from the Christian faith, is when I realized I wasn't actually around Christians. I was around Baptist Book Club members. That's all it is. It's a Baptist Book Club. I was a member of the First Baptist Book Club of Cabot, Arkansas. So that's all it really is. You can't call yourself a Christian and not implore people to change their faith. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And I remember I took this I actually practiced this. I would actually go door to door sharing the gospel with people at school, because I believed it was right. And looking back, do I regret being a Christian? Yes and no. Was I wrong to do that? Yes. Was I wrong within the scope of Christianity, though? No. If you're a Christian, that's what you should be doing. If you're not doing that, you're simply not a Christian. There's no other way around it. You can't do it, and you can't not do it and call yourself a Christian still. You're just a Bible Book Club member. That's all you are. It's just another club. If you're not inviting new members, you must not really believe what you're doing is the truth. Or you're just a complete asshole, in which case you're not a Christian. once again. So it's really that cut and dry. I hope you're willing to see that. There goes my alarm. But I hope you're willing to see that because it really is that straightforward. And one of the reasons people don't do this, though, is because they're afraid what they believe isn't true. And they're right for this, because if you're afraid that what you believe isn't true, why are you believing it? It's just, and at that point you realize, oh, this isn't an actual, like a truth, the one way kind of thing. It's a culture thing. It's a lifestyle thing. This isn't actually the one way to heaven. It's just a lifestyle thing. I live in America, so I believe in Christianity. I live in India, so I believe in Islam. It's just, or Hinduism. I don't remember which it is. But anyways, that's really why it is the way it is. And I shared my faith a gazillion times. And the more I did it, the more I realized it was a bunch of bullshit. It was a bunch of bullshit. I realized I was just rehearsing things I had been taught without actually looking into it. I was just re-saying it over and over. I actually looked into it. I was like, do I actually believe this? And so that's another reason people don't share their faith, is because they don't actually believe that it's true. And they're afraid to question it because it's uncomfortable. So then they actually have to think for themselves. So non-thinkers and non-questioners are always going to be slaves to the questioners and the free thinkers. Because those are the people that create the religions, man. Those are the people that make up stuff. And of course they don't want you questioning it, because if you question the religion, there wouldn't be any followers of the religion, and therefore there wouldn't be a religion. So chew on that a little bit.